It's 1 o'clock, and welcome from the EMA building to our workshop on a data quality framework for medicines regulation. I'm really pleased to introduce Emma Cook, Executive Director at the European Medicines Agency, to open our workshop. Emma, please.
Thank you, Peter. And indeed, it's my great pleasure to welcome you all to this joint EMA-HMA TEDAS framework, which is all about developing a data quality framework for medicines regulation. Adoption of an EU data quality framework will help us to support and enable trust of patients and healthcare professionals in the decisions that are reached by regulators when data underpins these decisions. Today's workshop is an initiative of HMA, of EMA and TEDAS, and it aims to share the current progress on building a data quality framework for medicines regulation, but also to solicit comments and ideas of experts in the field, because this will help us shape an appropriate framework. We'll have breakout sessions which will focus on particular use cases with discussions on the data quality landscape and how the future of data quality in medicines regulation should look at in clinical and non-clinical domains. Now, let me move to the objectives of the workshop. You should see these on the slides in front of you now. Just to reiterate the objectives of today's meeting. So what we need to do, what we want to do today and what our objectives are really are to engage with all of you in a discussion on the content and approach to a data quality framework for medicines regulation. We want to collect input from experts and we want to learn from experience. And we want to prioritize use cases which will allow us to focus further on in-depth analysis. I'm delighted to note the interest of the workshop was raised and the level of engagement across the spectrum of stakeholders and experts. And this is particularly important because we would like to build the framework taking advantage of your input, open consultation and collaboration. So the high interest in today's event is very, very positive. I'd like to thank you again for engaging. Your input is really, really valuable to us, and I wish you a very, very successful day. Thank you very much and good luck.
Thanks very much, Emma. Yeah, very much looking forward to an interesting expert day on such an important topic. Every time we talk about data and talk about big data, the number one issue that's raised by our stakeholders is the quality of data. And of course, data quality applies right across submissions to a regulator, be it quality manufacturing, non-clinical, so a very, very broad topic. Thanks very much, Emma. So let's move straight on then to Peter Bachmann. Peter is Head of International Liaison Office at the Federal Institute for Drugs and Medical Devices, BfArM, in Germany. He's a member of the Big Data Steering Group, and importantly, he's also the Vice Chair of the EU Network Data Board. That's a lot of feathers in your cap, Peter. Over to you for some opening remarks, please.
Okay, many thanks, Peter Arlett, and many thanks for the kind invitation to give this opening remarks. I think I have to build up on what, as Emma already said, it's a joint initiative and we have to keep this in mind. It also means that what we are now doing is a well-planned process. So it's not an ad hoc thing, whatever. So if I can have the next slide, what we have clearly seen, it's already part of the Big Data Steering Group work plan, where we clearly said we need something about data quality and representative of data. So it's well framed in this. Can I have the next one? And as there was a lot of discussions already in the Big Data Steering Group and also in the report and the recommendation, it was very clear that big data requires the use of data not originally intended for the regulatory decision making and understanding. Quality is challenging. So the big problem is for big data, it's not intended for the purpose we are using it. So the question is about the quality of the data which we are using in our processes. And this was also mirrored by the public consultation and the comments we have received. This clearly said we need to establish a certification process for data sources to say, yes, that's a good source, we can use it. And the other important message was also that data quality is not a static construct, but it's depending on its context we are using it, and depending also on the different healthcare systems we have in the European Union or the European Economic Area. So as a result of this, it's clearly said that the data quality is the basis that we need, that all patient and healthcare professionals can trust us with the decision we are reaching if we are using big data. And this is reflected in the Big Data Steering Group report in the recommendation, which clearly says, yes, we need to establish a data quality framework for regulatory use of big data sources, which associated data quality metrics. And we have to do something about the expansion of qualification advice procedures to establish renewable certification of data sets, because that's exactly, they are moving, we use it for different targets. Establish criteria for reliability of device-based diagnostics and others in video diagnostic, and proactive external communication to promote adoption of data quality framework. And last, I think we should not forget it, we still have what on our agenda is to promote the use of ISO IDMP standards. Have the next one. So it means what is then the applicability and intended use? It means we need a clear data framework, which is then also tailored for the intended regulatory purpose. So it means, at least to my understanding, we need an overarching data quality framework, which has then be also addressed by specific data quality framework if we really speak about specific regulatory purposes. So coming back to the definition that we are using for big data, it's meant, if you speak about big data, it's extremely large database. It doesn't mean they are not structured, but it's extremely large data set. And the second message in the whole story is, even if we have small databases, as soon as we connect them, it could be that the sum is more than the individual parts. So even if we are saying, yes, we have well-structured and reliable databases on a specific small subject, if we combine them, it could be that we are running into the problem of big data. So as Ima has already mentioned, we have a lot of data around. So you have real-world data, electronic health records, or whatever you call. We have clinical trial data, which are mostly well-structured. Spontaneous reporting, which is often quite the opposite. We have a lot on the quality of medicines and its manufacturing, genomic data, imaging data, and not forget all the different aspects from the veterinary sector. So the whole thing is not only for the human part, but we need this framework also for human and veterinary, and this should be the same one. Can I have the next one, please? Okay, as already mentioned, the whole thing about data quality is part of the Network Strategy 2025. So it clearly says within this network strategy, we need to establish a new framework for data quality, discoverable and representative through agreement on metadata for regulatory purpose, a standardization roadmap, and registers of real-world data sources and observational studies. So it's all well framed. We only have to fill it in now so that we're really getting something out of it. Can I have the next, please? So as we have agreed, we will have a stepwise approach on this, drafting the data quality framework. And what we are currently in is as well phase 1 as phase 2. But we will start with phase 2, and that's exactly where we are now in with this workshop, because it says we need to organize a data quality workshop to collect requirements and feedback on the structure proposed, and also to collect in the consultation phase, which will follow up, and during the workshops, the priority use cases to be used in phase 2. So it's both, it's a generic collection, what we need, and the second one is also it's building the foundation for the phase 2, which will then start afterwards. And I think with this, I would like to thank you and close the opening remarks. Back to Peter.
Thanks very much, Peter. Indeed, very helpful overview And I agree, we're going to have, I think, and it'll come out later in the workshop, but the idea is to start arching high-level common understanding, by that I mean framework, on data quality, and then potentially there are then deep dives onto the specifics of different aspects, be they real-world evidence or other, and I think that's going to come out in later parts of the workshop. Before we close this session, I would like to just go through some housekeeping, and forgive me, but I think it's important. The workshop is recorded and broadcast live, and therefore by attending the meeting, you're consenting to the recording and the broadcast. Due to the event format with interactive breakout sessions, people all have the ability to mute and unmute themselves. It's obviously very important that you keep yourself muted when you're not intervening. At the end of plenary session 2, we've allocated time for a Q&A session. You can put your hand up and then unmute yourselves when you're given the floor by the chair. You can also put interventions into the chat box in the bottom right-hand corner of the screen. We will try, or the chair of the relevant sessions will try and give balance between stakeholders of different groups. Obviously, it's not always going to be possible to give everybody the floor. It will depend on time management. The housekeeping rules for the breakout sessions will be addressed at the end of plenary session 1 by Paolo Alcini. So with that, I draw to a close the welcome, and I hand over to Hilmar Hamann, who's Head of Information Management at the EMA, and is also, and importantly, the Vice Chair of the EU Network Data Board. So Hilmar, happy to hand over to you. Thank you.
Hi, Peter. I think that Hilmar is not connected yet.
Quality control systems for secondary use of data, Peter Berzin from Odyssey, and finally, Paola will explain the breakout sessions before we close. If at any stage Hilmar joins, give me a shout, colleagues. So Paolo, I hand straight on to you for your presentation on data quality frameworks analysis. Thank you, Paolo.
Okay, so thanks a lot, Peter. Good afternoon, colleagues. As already mentioned, the agency, in collaboration with the Big Data Steering Group and other stakeholders, we are putting together the data quality framework. Can we go to the next slide, please? So in order to develop the data quality framework, what we are doing is to make a review of what is already existing outside and consulting stakeholder, and this is why we have this workshop today, and we will do also public consultation, as Peter mentioned. So at the moment we have performed the first step, and therefore meaning we have looked around in order to collect information on existing data quality framework and try to understand what is being done. And in particular, we are looking at framework that has been used within the European regulatory network for medicine regulation, and which are setting out principles to assess and measure data quality across multiple use cases that are applicable to the use of data within the medicine regulatory regulation in European network. The healthcare sector in Europe, we all know that is generating a lot of data, and this is contained in electronic system, and those are hosted in primary system, specialized and hospital care, drug and disease registries, clinical trial, genetic and genomic testing, and so on. Can we go to the next slide? So what was our approach? Our approach was to make a research looking on the World Wide Web, and also looking at our contacts and other stakeholders that we had the possibility to interact with. And in particular, the web is saturated with articles, ideas, or abstract that are approaching the concept of data quality. And this is covering basically all use cases, more or less. And we needed a way in order to identify the ones that are going to be applicable to the regulatory network needs, and that addresses all the use cases that we have. The approach that we followed was to point out those data quality framework that have been tested and tried on in real life and address the need for regulatory use and cover as many data space as possible. When we talk about data space, is a kind of synonym of use cases. We have identified some challenges, meaning, for example, some existing framework are mainly focused on standardization as actionable, usable rule and framework. We may also have possibly missed some framework because we have time-boxed our research. So, for example, we have some criteria for taking on board the data quality framework in our research. So the framework, for example, should be formalized, meaning there is sufficient documentation and evidence that the framework has been applied against data and that have achieved the intended result, producing benefit. Also regulatory compliance. So the framework has proved to meet the need of the regulatory bodies for which has been drafted. Experience, so there is evidence also that other organizations and community applying the data quality framework against their real-world data. The fact also that the framework should be extensible in a sense that can be extended to include other data type or use cases that it was in comparison to the one that has been designed for. And also the existence that the framework provides that can be applied against the data in order to determine the readiness of the data and for the intended purpose. Can we go to the next? So we have identified a lot of use cases for which our EU data quality framework should be applicable, and we have analyzed all of them. We have use cases in the context of drug research, talk about omics, bioanalytic, veterinary use cases, in the context of electronic record, observational, genotyping, and many other data sources. Then we have drug development, both in preclinical and clinical setting. Then manufacturing, batch execution, purity, drug safety surveillance, spontaneous adverse drug reaction reporting, observational data, again, electronic health record, claims. Next. And we can continue. So, for example, for epidemiology, again, we have electronic health record, observational data, claims, social media, mobile health as well. Other use cases can be health economics and outcomes, drug and healthcare utilization. Next. And for all these use cases, we have identified framework, but also standard and taxonomy that can be applied and are being applied, in particular in the primary use of data. So in drug research, for example, we have the ISO 15189. In drug development preclinical, we have CDISC, in particular SEND. In drug and device manufacturing, we have a lot of standard. For example, is quite famous the IDMP standard. Next. And also we have identified a lot of again taxonomy that can be used, can be applicable for both primary and secondary use of data. In the context of drug safety surveillance, for example, we have OMOPS, NOMED, and we have CANS and BMC and NSCC as a data quality framework. NSCC we will hear a little bit more later on today. Then also for epidemiology and health economics outcome, we have again OMOPS, NOMED, ERICS norm. We have TEDAS, for which we will hear as well another presentation today. Next. drug utilization and so drug and health utilization, we have again many standards, and sometimes are the standard and the framework are also overlapping with other use cases. Also in the veterinary domain, we have SNOMED-CT, CDISC, and many other framework and standard. So we understand that there is again a lot of regulatory guidelines and control around the collection, quality, and reporting of primary use data, or as we define them, control data. So we don't want to reinvent the wheel, and therefore we will take note, document all of those. The in-depth analysis of data quality framework was focused on secondary use data or uncontrolled data, data that the regulatory body in a sense has no control over, but uses to make a regulatory decision. So we are going to go a little bit more in detail later on in the day, but we have a specific difference between control data and control data. The control data are produced in a process that controls the entire life cycle, including feedback loops to detect and correct error. We have quality assurance, quality control. And in most cases, these data are collected for the purpose of supporting regulatory decision and therefore are governed by existing regulation and guidelines. Uncontrolled data instead are collected for a different purpose, but then are used and exported for purposes of regulatory decision making, as we define secondary use. And the production process may or not be or not regulated regarding its primary use, but even if it does, the quality of data generated in such process and the fitness for purpose for the secondary use must be considered uncontrolled, and we need to have a deep look into that. Next. So if here we look, for example, in the primary use data, we have a lot of quality management system that make the data controlled. And once the data, we will see that we have a lot of steps in the quality management system control. We have the design of the data collection, we have the risk management, training, adverse event handling, corrective and preventive action. And also when we are using the data for uncontrolled use, we can do quality check, quality control on the data. But we will not be able to look at the previous step. Next. And here as well, what we are trying to solve, we will need to identify a data quality framework for non-standard and also standardized data. So if, for example, we see in this picture, the idea is that we have a lot of database coming from different member states, for example. And at this stage, we will have a possibility to have a framework that is creating data quality assurance before kind of centralizing the data. And therefore, afterwards, we will be able to condense the various databases at the member state level in a standardized data set, and therefore we will be able to make a loop there in order to identify the problem, implementing corrective action. Afterwards, the idea will be to do data quality assurance framework post-centralization. So we will be able to look at all this data set as a whole and to be able to use this data in a different setting for different use cases and to perform data analysis in order to support both decision-making and scientific assessment. Next. And again, we have as mentioned, we have identified several data quality framework, and many of them are concentrating on different data quality dimensions. The dimensions are used to determine if the analysis, if the analyzed data is fit for the regulatory purpose for the specific use cases for which they've been built for. And the idea is that the more dimension that the framework covers, the more extensible the framework could be. And that should be my last slide for this topic. Thank you, Chair. Ilmar, over to you.
Thank you, Paolo, and apologies for being late. Actually, you were ahead of me. So it's a pleasure to be here. First of all, my name is Hilmar Hamann. I'm the head of information management at the European Medicines Agency. And it's really a pleasure to be here and chairing this session about data quality and really in preparation of the breakout sessions. My background really is in information management, and and to say the least, data quality is close to my heart, because what I've seen in many of the information management or IT projects, that it typically comes down to not the technology being the challenge, but really the data quality. So with this, it is also my pleasure to introduce our next speaker, and I hope I say this, pronounce this correctly. I put on my Croatian accent, Danica Marinac-Dabic. She is the Associate Director for the Office of Clinical Evidence and Analysis at the US FDA in the Center for Devices and Radiological Health, CDRH. And here, Danica has been leading the efforts of the Center for Devices to really bridge the patient-centered outcomes research and health technology innovation through coordinated registry networks in 12 clinical areas. And Danica will introduce us to a maturity model that has been used in the context of these medical device registries. So please, Danica, welcome, and over to you.
Good afternoon and greetings from the US. And what an honor to be part of this wonderful workshop. I look forward not just to these talks this morning, but also to the breakout sessions to participate in. I will first walk through the concept of coordinated registry networks and registries that have been used in the medical devices, and then we'll give a couple of examples from one clinical area, and also leave you with some of the facts about how these registries already contribute to the regulatory decision-making based on the framework that we've developed. Next slide, please. So when we talk about strategically coordinated registry networks, we are really talking about the real-world data sources that encompass strategically partnered electronic health information systems that serve one or more clinical areas. They actually build on the national and regional traditional legacy registries, but add additional value, strategically harmonizing them, their data elements, and link the data coming from registries to comparable data across other systems. For example, electronic health records. We can, in fact, leverage the lessons learned, for example, from vascular space and apply them potentially to neurovascular space. So we have done a number of these efforts, and I will be sharing some of them. So back in 2015, the CRN concept was born, at least. The FDA commissioned at the time the National Medical Device Registry Task Force to look into the entire portfolio of the registries and their role in the evolving national evaluation system for health technology that we were conceiving of at the time. The principles behind the existing national, regional, and other large-scale efforts can actually get us where we need to be. So this was happening in 2015. You may recall that International Medical Device Regulators Forum kicked off the major effort to focus on patient registries, with the definition of the medical device registry as an organized system with the primary aim to increase the knowledge of medical devices, contributing to the quality of patient care, that continuously collects relevant data, evaluates meaningful outcomes, and comprehensively covers the population defined by exposure to particular devices at a reasonable generalizable scale. I had an honor to chair this working group for 3 years. And the reason why this definition was so important is because that sort of made that leap from the registry as an infrastructure to conduct particular study, to address a particular question, to a registry that is envisioned to be really embedded in the healthcare, be embedded to actually stay there for multiple stakeholders to be using the outputs of this registry. Next slide. So now, fast forward to 2017, in a major initiative and partnership between the Food and Drug Administration and the Office of the Assistant Secretary for Health at the planning and evaluation level, there were two major grants that were given to specifically develop strategically coordinated registry networks. Next slide. So let us dive into the framework itself. The actual major feature maturity model that we developed focuses on 7 domains and 5 levels of maturity. The first domain is unique device identifier. And this speaks about the ability of the registry to precisely identify the medical devices and their attributes. The second domain focuses on data collection efficiency. And what this means is how well and how efficient data are captured in the registry through structured data capture, mobile apps, and automation with interoperability solutions. So they're trying to reduce the burden on the collection of the data in the registries and these networks. The third domain focuses on data quality, and it has a number of subdomains that you can appreciate. The first one talks about the coverage or scale of the registry. The second is completeness and of enrollment and records at both baseline and the follow-up, and also sort of the requirement to have periodic audits to ensure the quality of this data. The fourth domain of the maturity model is ability of the registry to collect the data throughout the entire product life cycle, and to be able to serve as an infrastructure for conducting the research and surveillance and different stages of device evaluation. And one can certainly appreciate the important role of data linkages in order to do so longitudinally. The next domain is governance and sustainability. Again, making a leap from the registries that are only owned and controlled by one particular sector of the society, but rather engaging major stakeholders, professional societies, payers, various states, obviously in the United States, and obtaining certainly major and diverse funding to ensure the sustainability of these efforts. The next domain has to do with the healthcare quality improvement as a major function of the registry or networks. Because device technologies require continued evaluation and feedback, benchmarking, and outlier assessment is of utmost importance. So the final and probably the most important part of the framework is how we engage the patients and in incorporation of patient-generated data into the registry, not just as them being part of the research, but also evaluating patient preferences, measure general and disease-specific patient-reported outcomes, and engaging patients throughout the development and execution of the registry efforts. So with these 7 domains, we also identify 5 levels of the maturity, from early learner through making progress status to defining path to success, well-managed registries and networks, and optimized. And you can see that in these names, we try to be very positive and to give some wind to the wings of the registries that are trying to be more mature and not try to penalize the ones that are not at the level 5 yet. Next slide. So if we give an example of one of these domains, being a data collection deficiency domain, which, as I mentioned, speak about the extent to which the registry is embedded in the healthcare quality improvement system, so that data collection occurs as part of the care. We can talk about the level 1, which in fact is can be viewed also as a heavy burden in terms of the ad hoc data elements only used on a project basis, without a core minimum data set being developed, and not necessarily being able to be actually used in the generalizable population yet. And I'm not going to skip the levels 2 through 4, but just to let you to sort of immediately go to the level 5, which is where we envision registries to be when they have the technologies in place, for example, structured data extraction from EHRs, mobile apps, for all core minimum data elements, and there is a full adoption and integration of data and terminology standards, again, assuming the complete interoperability. This maturity network, just to mention, will be published this month in the BMJ journal as a special supplement, along with other CRN efforts that we've done over the past couple of years. So stay tuned for this. Should be coming soon in its full length. Next slide, please. To give you an example what this actually means in action. This is a vision network, which stands for Vascular Implant Surveillance Intervention and Outcome Network in the United States. What you see on the right side is what used to be the infrastructure in the United States called Vascular Quality Initiative, which currently has over 1 million patients in this particular clinical space. What we were able to add to this by applying this framework is to actually link the data to the major state-based longitudinal data sources from the state of New York, from California, from some of the CoreNet networks, mobile app, clinical trials data from industry, and also all the data coming from the Medicare and Medicaid services, which actually adds additional value because now we have linked data from 2012 to 2019, completed number of validation studies in this network, over 14,000 patients participating in them. And now over 400,000 patients are captured in these current efforts. And on the left side, you see the linkage breadth, for example, over 80, almost 90% of all endovascular intervention patients in these registries are fully linked to other data sources. And over 90% of all abdominal aortic aneurysm patients procedures were in fact linked. So this has been published. We are using this for regulatory decision making already. Next slide. Now, just to give you a sense that this is not really only about the vascular, we have additional 12 clinical areas for a total of 13 now, ranging from women's health through vascular cardiac, orthopedics, neurospace, as you can see, prostate ablation, breast implants, abdominal core, and just the latest one that we're working on is the end-stage kidney disease, CRN. What's important to say about here is that there is a lot of cross-pollination across these areas in the number of efforts, harmonization of architecture, logic model for clinical workflow, methodologies. There have been 16 tools shared and applied, and those can be found on our Medical Device Epidemiology Network website, and I provided that in the previous slide. Again, it's important to say this is about the national infrastructure, and in our evolving National Evaluation System for Health Technology, or NEST, this is really one of the major nodes within the evolving system. Next slide. To give you also a sense very quickly of, if we can go to the next slide, I want to just to give you a sense that this is really a basis for enormous international collaboration, and this is to the credit to VascuNet and European efforts through this international consortium of vascular registry that we partnered with and we support from our MD EpiNet Analytical Center at Weill Cornell Medicine, and also from a high-performance integrated virtual environment which serves under grant from FDA. This is important because this partnership has 28 regional and national registries and embraced fully a CRN concept with a lot of harmonization, validation, and outcome studies being done under these auspices. Collaborative studies underway, which would be an interest of our colleagues from Europe, for potential labeling change in the ruptured AAA space, which is currently underway and potentially will be leading to a change of labeling in this particular field. To call your attention, in the next month's meeting of this international consortium in Granada, Spain, when there is a lot of opportunity to learn about lessons learned from this area. Next slide, and I think that's my last slide. Would like to call your attention to this report that FDA made available publicly, which contains 90 examples of the real-world evidence that are used in medical device regulatory decisions. Many of them come from the registries that I outlined. They are being currently used for post-market surveillance, mandated post-approval studies, labeling, inspections, And I would like also to draw attention to these two publications that have been published in the British Medical Journal about return on investment on studies documenting the value of using registries and coordinated registry networks in the regulatory decision making. One of them stating return on investment as high as 550%. So again, I just call for you to actually review those papers, and potentially they might be also something that you can incorporate in your framework. Thank you very much for your attention today.
Thank you so much, Danica. Really very impressive results, very impressive example from the field of the medical device registries. So I'm sure there will be more time to discuss in the breakout session and later in the Q&A. Thank you so much. I'll, in the interest of time, I think we'll be moving on, and I'm really pleased to also introduce our next speaker, Enrique Bernal Delgado, who is a senior scientist and the head of data science for health services and policy research at the Institute for Health Sciences in Spain. And Enrique will tell us about the efforts under the TIDAS joint action, and specifically the work package 6, which is called Excellence in Data Quality, and where we are really looking at developing guidance to ensure data quality in support of the European health data space, especially on the secondary use of the data. So welcome, Enrique, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Hilma. Good afternoon, everyone. Actually, it's a pleasure because this is a joint collaboration with EMA and TEDAS. We're really glad to try to liaise, and this is the first, wide open opportunity for that. In these 10 minutes, I'm going to present you what has been actually a work in progress. So we're about to publish the first draft, more mature draft on the data quality framework that we are outlining for the secondary use of data. And this is in the context, next slide, please. This is in the context of a joint action. For those not familiar with the joint action, this is a joint effort of member states and the Commission. 25 member states are actually collaborating in this joint action towards the European health data space. Along with the European Commission, and the overarching goal of that is developing and promoting concepts for the secondary use of health data with some specificity on routine data for three purposes. One of the purposes is policy making. The second one is regulation, actually, and the third one is health research of any kind. Next slide, please. So there are a number of work areas. Obviously, when thinking of mobilizing data that exists and mobilizing for secondary purposes, we have to think on governance models, on how these institutions that will have a role in the European health data space are backed by legislation, how the legislation has an effect, an impact on the decisions made. Is also talking about data quality. We'll take some time now to talk about that. Also, we are aiming to provide options for the technical interoperability within the European health data space. And finally, there are discussions on other work area that is dedicated to try to frame how citizens will interact with the European health data space for secondary use. Next slide, please. In the particular case of excellence in data quality, I'm co-leading this work with our colleagues of the Central Region of Denmark. The data quality framework is very much recommending on the concept, where these concepts should be implemented, when with the data life cycle, how should be implemented by whom, and also provide recommendations on those standards of interoperability that may help secondary use, particularly when it comes to discovery, the data sources that are there of interest for the purposes that I mentioned earlier, so policymaking, regulation, and health research. Also on those that are allowing, those standards allowing us to build layers of interoperability across data sources, across institutions in Europe. And then standards of interoperability for the communication across nodes in this space. Next slide, please. So basically, what the concept of quality will be for the European Health Data Space for secondary use, where to be implemented, when in the data lifecycle, how should be implemented, and who should implement the data quality framework. This, I'm going to come across these 5 elements now, starting from the concept in the next slide, please. 2 elements in the concept. One is that procedures matter and also content matters. So we are then trying to figure out how the institutions, let's call it data institutions in Europe, can be trustworthy institutions for the rest of the nodes, conforming the federation of nodes in the European Health Data Space for secondary use. Then some of the elements in this data quality framework are institutions should be auditable, should publish metadata in a standard way, should standardize the preparation of the data, and should publish how they have standardized data. And the data integration, so the efforts, the processes to mobilize the data towards some end user should be transparent, but also the content. And then the elements that are in the discussions have been on top of those dimensions that would cover the 3 elements, the 3 purposes of the European Health Data Space for secondary purposes, sorry, for secondary use, are reliability, relevance, timeliness, coherence, coverage, and completeness. Next slide, please. Then where to be implemented. Here we are following, I mean, this is quite under discussion because as you've seen in my previous, I think it was the second slide, the working group on governance is working precisely on the kind of governance it should be implemented in the European Health Data Space. But we are now proposing at this point in time that the realm of the very edge of the European Health Data Space for secondary use are the data subjects and the data controllers in terms of the GDPR Article 4. And we are very much thinking that will be in the nodes in this inner area that you see, in the nodes, in the way they play the role of data processors, also as in the GDPR Article 4, those institutions that are processing the data will be the main subjects of this data quality framework. Next slide, please. And when in the data lifecycle, next slide, please. Let's zoom up. Well, in all these steps in the data lifecycle, for secondary use, we may find some elements in terms of quality that should be taken into account. But maybe there are three elements, three steps in this data life cycle that actually will benefit a lot from a clear data quality framework that is shared across the data processors in Europe. And the data preparation process, so we are not taking here into account the origins of the data, so the data controllers, the data subjects as data controllers. We're starting from the inner area of that green ring in the previous slide. And then there are 3 elements in the data preparation that could be highlighted: collection of the data, standardization of the data, and publication of the data. In these 2, standardization and publication, will be main steps to where the data quality framework should be implemented in the data processors. As you may imagine, in the standardization step, what semantic interoperability is required, mapping to the main standards, and providing or building or implementing interoperability layers. In the case of publication, metadata standards, so it's easy for any end user to discover in the next step, to discover what data sources are, what is the provenance of data sources, what is the content, what are the features, and what is the potential access, etc., etc. So these 2 elements, semantic interoperability in the standardization of the data coming from the data controllers, and the metadata standards that allow discovery for the end user. And then when it comes to the user's interaction, there is a step, a critical one. The user has been granted access to the data, that the data processors who actually prepare the data for purpose. This is the place that fitting for purpose. And then data grid integration is a must. And then elements as linkage, elements as anonymity or pseudonymity are elements that are quite top on the agenda of the data processor at this point. So in this case, we have to apply some elements, clear elements from the data quality framework. As I said, all these steps have elements that could be actually treated as potential issues for data quality, but these three darker ones are the big ones in the application of the data quality framework. Next slide, please. Who should be implemented? Sorry, how should be implemented? Well, very much on the idea of the maturity model explained recently. We can enforce. In this case, for example, we have provided some recommendation for the legislative proposal, a coming legislative proposal with regard to the fact that the data institutions should be auditable, and then regular audits could help to improve, could have to be a trustworthy institution within the realm of the European health data space for secondary use. But we also may use recommendations, soft regulation, let's call it. But we are much more interested in the maturity element, which is there. Well, we can actually assess how data quality is in the not from the origins, as I said, but in the data processes. Once data is collected and is in the within the European health data space for secondary purpose, let's promote incentives. Let's benchmark with others, and then let's promote them. So this is the point about the maturity. We are working on this part now. So the enforcement part has been already delivered, and we are working on the other two. And the last slide, please. And who should implement the data quality framework? Well, actually, it is not clear yet because this is very much a hidden topic within the discussions in Work Package 5. So it's not my actual direct responsibility, but we are interacting with them to see who in this landscape, who in this environment should be in charge of the implementation. Of course, the operational implementation should be in the data processors, but an authority, national or international, so cross-national, could be one of the solutions. So maybe the data permit authorities that have been mentioned at some point in the regulation, etc. So we are very much interested in someone that is out of the nodes in the end. The nodes are playing the role of data processors, but also are playing the role of being a secure processing environment, and the place where the data users end up interacting with. So someone else that is not in that role should be actually who should implement, supervise the implementation and make decisions upon that. So last slide and final, thank you very much for joining today, and very much appreciate the effort of EMA to cover this complex element about the use of data for regulatory purposes. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Enrique. Thank you for the very interesting presentation and also sharing this important piece of work under TDES with us here today. So we're now transitioning into the fourth presentation of this plenary. And it's my pleasure to introduce Peter Berzin. He is the head of quality assurance and quality control at Odyssey. And his background is really in regulatory compliance from a software and data engineering perspective, and then also looking at clinical trial systems and the end-to-end process. And Peter will then take us through some real-life examples of how a data quality framework can be applied to data collection and data quality in your quality management and quality control systems. So thank you for being here today, and over to you, Peter.
Omar, thank you so much. I appreciate the time today. We've been working extensively, Odysseus, IQVIA, with EMA, TEDAS, HMA, in order to analyze the current data quality frameworks, and then present later on in the discussions. We will have questions regarding each aspect of the data quality framework, and as well as a structure or draft structure that we would present later on. But what we wanted to do right now is reiterate the quality control systems for secondary use data. As you guys have heard previously in the discussions, that we are concentrated on secondary use data, and we would like to talk about why. So if we can go to the next slide. So to reiterate, we are talking about two different types of data. There's the primary use data, which is data produced for the purpose in a, what should be a fully controlled process, and secondary use data, which is created for another purpose and then reused for ours. And our purpose, next slide, is regulatory decision making. So for primary use data, quality is typically woven into the process and the design of the organization. They would use a quality management system that would give them almost a step-by-step directions and checklists in order to maintain quality assurance during the data collection, during the data storage and data transfer process. Now, secondary use data, once that data is already picked up from the data store and transferred over by the sponsor, for example, for a clinical trial, over for regulatory use, that quality needs to be addressed after the fact, right? We do not have the ability to go back, look at the data, see that something was entered incorrectly, ask the doctor at the site for the clinical trial to re-enter the data, right? We have to take the data as it is, and so we apply quality control or a quality framework. Next slide. So the examples of the data types, and I don't want to spend too much time on this, especially with the interest of time and getting to the breakout sessions. We have already reviewed the use cases that we were concentrating on. Some of the ones for the primary use data, we have drug research, preclinical, different data stores, which is the omics data type, bioanalytical. We have the clinical trial use case with clinical trial data. Again, the concentration is not only for human clinical trials, as well as for veterinary or animal trials as well. Manufacturing, we have batch execution, different data that's coming from there. There's the data of the product specifications, the purity, viable cell density for from bioreactors. Those types of information really had an initial purpose, which we call a primary use data. And that data remains fully controlled by multiple regulatory bodies, which we'll see in just a second. Secondary use data, which our concentration is on, is patient animal-centric longitudinal clinical data, things like electronic health records, insurance claims, registry, clinical data after trial completion. Now, I underline that for a specific reason, because Breakout Session 3 specifically concentrates on augmented secondary use data, possibly with primary use data. Other person-animal level data, we concentrate on spontaneous adverse reports. We had genomics data, social media, mobile, and social detriments of health. Now, the reason, next slide, we call secondary use data uncontrolled. Let's talk about QMS versus QC, which is quality management systems are considered a controlled environment. What does that mean? As Paolo mentioned in the landscape analysis, there is a plethora of regulations and guidelines for primary use data. Like, for example, we have ISO 9000 family, that is quality management systems on all levels of an organization. What we don't mention here is ISO 25012. That is a guideline around data quality modeling, the characteristics on the back end. We have ISO 8000, that's for data quality for enterprise master data and the exchange between data partners. And finally, we have GXP, which I'm sure you are all familiar, but that's a family for good manufacturing, clinical, documentation, laboratory practices. Now, I've already exhausted myself just speaking about some of those regulations and guidelines that exist in the quality management system. Now, the quality management system is considered a controlled environment because that is where the organizations ensure data quality. It's called quality assurance. Now, once that organization packages up the data and sends it over, that data is now considered uncontrolled. What does that mean? If a clinical trial data is sent by the sponsor over to the EMA, and they start applying data characteristics or dimensions, which we'll see in a second, on top of that data to ensure accuracy, uniqueness, completeness. We now look at the data, and if there are issues, we cannot go back and redo the data. We cannot reconduct the trial just because some of the doctors messed up with the data. So what we have to do is apply the data quality framework and make a decision. Do we flag the data? Do we delete it? Or do we just keep it into our in our data source in order for our decision making? Next slide. So the concentration, as you will see throughout this workshop, is on secondary use data. We will have conversations in the breakout session upcoming, possibly using primary data in order to augment our secondary use data studies and analyses. So keep that in mind. Next slide. Now, the quality control is defined by various data quality characteristics and dimensions. I believe Enrique touched up on this, as well as Danica. We see that in this example that I've created, we have personal or animal data. We have drug or treatment data on the right and site on the bottom. What this shows is an overlap of data quality characteristics that we can apply on each level. So for example, a person or an animal has to be unique. Drug has to be complete. We have to understand that that drug, when applied against the animal, which is the relevance, we have to ensure that a female patient that does not receive treatment for prostate cancer. We have to understand that a dog cannot receive treatment or a cat drug during a trial. That's the relevance. The precision is the person or the animal has to be consistent at a site. The site has to be consistent across the data sources. The drug has to conform to the unique country's requirements. And then finally, in the middle, timeliness. Was the data collected at the right time when it was supposed to, or was the data collected after the insurance claim was put in, or before or during? So all those data elements are important to check for secondary use data. Next slide. We can see some of the domains. Now, again, the previous slide was just an example. We are just giving you the data quality characteristics that are being checked by the various frameworks that we have assessed. Some of these are overlapping and repetitive, but others like accuracy, consistency, sensitivity, precision, those are important to capture and to evaluate the data source, as we spoke about earlier. Is this data source viable for our decision making today? Will it allow us to make the proper decision from a regulatory perspective and release that decision out into the public, or are we going to regret it after the fact? So the data quality framework concentrates on that specifically. Now, next slide. So we summarize the difference between the quality management system, which already has the plethora and the numerous regulatory guidelines in place for data quality, for the transfer of that data and the management of that data. We also see that the quality control is possible and needed for secondary use data. And finally, the quality dimensions applied are dependent on the purpose of data. Now, Paolo showed this in a diagram earlier in the landscape analysis, but what I wanted to do is just give a quick explanation. The top, the columns, it's hard to see, but they are the data characteristics that each framework focuses on. You can see its accuracy, completeness, consistency, conformity, plausibility, persistence, timeliness, uniqueness, validity, and integrity. And the check marks are for each of the data quality frameworks and which ones they cover on the data quality dimensions. So the point of this document was for us to be able to consolidate the thoughts and ideas from multiple frameworks in order to build one that works for the EMA purpose. And I believe that ends the slides. So I'd like to just thank you for your time and hand that back out to Hilmar. Thank you, Hilmar.
Thank you, Peter, for this very clear explanation, the difference between quality management, quality control. I think that's going to be very helpful in the further discussions. So thanks again. I think we're now moving into the last presentation, which is really intended to prepare us for the breakout sessions. Paolo will take us through the slides. Over to you, Paolo.
Thank you, Ilmar. Can we go to the next slide? So the objective of the breakout session is really to present some key aspects that we have identified during our landscape analysis and get your feedback from it in order to design, to draw ideas, recommendations, and potentially possible solution for establishing later on the data quality framework that we are talking about. All the feedback and comment that we are going to get from you during this session will be used to shape the overall data quality framework, and we are going later on to share with you during a public consultation. Next. So for the housekeeping, some housekeeping rules. During the breakout session, you will be automatically transferred to the breakout session according to your allocated preference. The breakout session will be activated prior a short break, so that in case we have some technical issue, we should be able to sort them out. And once you are successfully connected in the breakout session, you will have time for a break. Each session is scheduled for 45 minutes, and during the discussion, if you wish to speak, you should raise your hand in WebEx, and when the chair gives you the floor, you can unmute yourself, and following your intervention, please click on the icon again to lower your hand and mute your microphone. After the breakout session, when the session is ended, you will be automatically transferred back to the plenary and main meeting room. And also we will have a short break prior the second plenary session. Next. So we have already distributed to all of you the scope, the aim, and the question that we are going to discuss in each session. So in the interest of time, I will not go through them again. I will just remember that for breakout session, we will have Enrique as chair. We will have a person from us taking notes live during the session for each question, and each question will be time boxed to around 10 minutes in order to allow to discuss all the questions. And at the end, during the break, our colleague will try to organize all the feedback received in a summary session, sorry, in a summary slide like this one, where that is going to be presented at the beginning of plenary 2. For the second session, we have another chair, that is Frank Petavi from EMEA, and the third session is going to be chaired by Xavier Kortz, still from EMEA. I think that we can then move to the breakout session, Ilmar, and actually to the break. Mr. Chair, Enrique, when you want, you can start.
Thank you, Paolo. Welcome to the second plenary session, where we are going to know more about the discussions made in the different breakout sessions, and we'll have time to discuss largely on the reports provided by our colleagues. Each of the sessions have had a rapporteur, and I'm going to introduce you them all. In the breakout session 1, we'll be presenting Luis Piñeiro. Is expert in data analytics and methods task force at EMA, as doctor in pharmacy, and has a master in epidemiology, currently acting as applicant in PhD applicant for health data science. in representing and telling us the discussions in Breakout Session 2 is Sophia Irini Australia. The second national expert at EMA is mathematician by training, with a specialization in biostatistics. Before being seconded to EMA, I've been working as a senior statistician at the University of Liverpool's Cancer Clinical Trials Unit. The third speaker will be Lifan Liu. This is the Academia Engagement Officer at EMA. Lifan is a medical doctor by training, and she received her doctoral degree on epidemiology and public health from the Erasmus University. And the fourth of our speakers is Christian Reich. He is VP Real World Data Solutions at IQVIA, developing federated research networks on the basis of OMOP, the Common Data Model, member of the steering group and principal investigator of Odyssey. Though these will be those presenting the results, and then we have as a moderator of the discussion slot, Peter Bachmann, the head of the International Liaison Office, Federal Institute for Drugs and Medical Devices, Germany. I think Luis is already there. Yeah, please, the time will be for each of the presentations, the minutes, and then we'll have 50 more minutes for discussion. Luis, please, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much, Enrique. Can you hear me?
Absolutely.
Oh,
Absolutely.
thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you. So let me just screen this. Second. That's the wrong place. Well, we'll leave it like that to facilitate. Okay. Okay, so for the breakout session 1, we had 4 questions that were discussed with a group. And the first question was, should secondary use of real-world data be accessible to or governed by regulatory bodies? And if so, how? Now, for that topic, there was obviously support for access to real-world data, particularly for safety and drug utilization use cases. However, there's also concerns raised around the lack of harmonization, the need for ethical approval of studies, and in general, what we heard were 3 keywords: consistency, standardization, and ethics of access. For the second question, are existing data quality frameworks sufficient to determine the quality and fit for regulatory purpose or use of regulatory real-world data? And if not, what are the challenges? The group pointed out that data quality and fit for purpose are potentially related topics, but they're distinct, and that regulatory agencies should be clear what is meant with fit for purpose for regulatory purpose. Data quality frameworks may need to be tailored to specific use cases, and the key issues that were raised was actually that need for a tailored data quality framework and flexibility. The third question was, are data standards needed, and is there a need to transform the data for data quality to be assessed? And for that, there was a note that it's difficult to create an overarching data quality framework, and it's difficult to assess data quality in a timely manner if we don't have standards. Data quality standards were also noted to be time dependent. That means that quality changes over time. Certain elements change in the data and may require updates to the data quality framework. Common data models have served well for medicines, but there was a point about the fact that they have not been as developed for medical devices. And for this question, the key term for us was interoperability. And finally, what regulatory guidance or influence is needed for secondary use of data, if any? The group pointed out that there's a need to ensure alignment and organized deployment across the EU of any sort of regulatory guidance, and that there was a specific comment I think was interesting on data verification from outside Europe. there's a need from stakeholders to have more clarity on what regulatory thresholds for quality are. So at which point do we say the quality is low? And here, the key terms that we heard was regulate and collaborate. So not just regulate, but be part of that public-private partnership, and thresholds for decision making. And that's it from me. Thank you so much, Enrique.
It is really efficient with just 4 minutes taken from the 10 you had. So I think we can move then to the next. We will have, time for clarification points, time for providing some nuances in the discussion part. So we can move then to actually Efficia Egini. Are you ready? Your presentation.
Yes, let me share it.
Okay, thank you very much.
And I hope you can all see it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you very much. Sorry, I was just highlighting some things in bold. So I just wanted to say we had received a lot of feedback, and thanks a lot to all the participants. It was really, really nice to hear all these different views. So our focus was on the primary use of data, and our first question was what measure of quality should preclinical, clinical, and manufacturing data conform to in the context of the regulatory decision making. So the thing that struck out and the key message from our breakout session. Sorry?
Excuse me, Tia, could you put in presentation mode because it's very small?
Oh, sorry. Is that better?
No, it's okay. Yeah, just the display settings and swap on top of the left corner.
Let me top. Just a moment. Let me do it again.
Yeah.
Is that any better?
Not yet. Let's see. Yeah, absolutely. Yep. Thank you very much.
Okay, sorry for that. So as I was saying before, what was really prominent from the feedback we received was that there is a lack of guidance in the preclinical setting when we compare this to the clinical and manufacturing setting. It was also highlighting that there are different, quality measures in per region, and across countries. The data quality was also noted that is context specific. So we need to accept various levels of quality depending on the research area we're focusing at. It was also highlighted that there is interplay with data quality for medical devices and other health technology assessments. And also it was pointed out that we also need to look at quality for algorithms, and that includes, artificial intelligence, machine learning, and NLP. In terms of how the existing preclinical, clinical, and manufacturing regulatory requirements or processes can be strengthened to produce, a better, a higher quality data, it was highlighted that we need to have a better, like an increased interaction between the regulators and the manufacturers. And this needs to happen at an early stage of the product development life cycle. And it was also noted that the impact of this is more, prominent, more acute on innovative products, like, for example, the advanced therapeutic medicinal products. And this impact also affects both the patients and also the research investment. It was also highlighted that we should leverage clinical trial data for also secondary use. Okay. And also that education and training on existing guidelines and guidances in the clinical and manufacturing area needs to take place and looked at.
Go spend time with Georgie.
And
he's all by himself.
Sorry, I can
please,
hear.
Please, Giulia, could you mute yourself? Giulia Di Bello. Thank you.
Okay, and lastly, it was noted that we shouldn't forget that data quality goes hand in hand with the quality of experiments. So we need to make sure that, we have high quality during the experiment phase to ensure that the quality at the later stages is also ensured. And lastly, in the last question was what barriers to high quality data currently exist with these data types. And the things that were highlighted was the lack of awareness of data quality standards for clinical and manufacturing, the data fragmentation and heterogeneity that exists, also the lack of interoperability across all the different domains. It was also highlighted that there is a lack of harmonization in the documentation processes, and that there is also selective reporting, specifically when it comes to the preclinical setting. It was also highlighted that there are data access barriers when it comes for inspection purposes. So it will be very important for inspectors to have access to the totality of data sets when they do their inspections. And also a last point that was noted was the lack of therapeutic areas guidances in some regions. And I think this was all from my side.
Thank you very much, Tikia. I think we can learn now about the breakout session number 3. Lifan Liu, please. Could you share your slides? I'm completely jealous about the capacity you have, guys, to synthesize a so difficult discussion in just 5 minutes. It's great. Thank you very much.
Colleagues,
Liu, please.
Yes, colleagues, can you see my slides?
Absolutely. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Dear colleagues, first of all, I'd like to thank all of your contributions. It was a fun, lovely, and active discussion for the past 45 plus 5 minutes. And in the session 3, we discussed where secondary and primary data can complement with each other, and we call it hybrid approach. And in the discussion, we have 2 questions to discuss. The first one is to discuss what are the challenges and opportunities in this hybrid approach. We identified first a couple of opportunities. Firstly, how to collect complementary data between primary and secondary data on study exposure and outcomes, which are the 2 key elements of epidemiology studies, like smoking, health care status, etc. And second opportunity, which is really a hot topic lately, is called registry-based randomized studies, which are primarily conducted in Nordic countries, Scandinavian countries, on medical devices and rare disease. So that's really a hot topic and very big opportunities for the hybrid approach. And then another opportunity is the feasibility to collect secondary data from patients and identify patient and collect the data afterwards. For example, to identify the patient in the primary setting, and then to recontact them and collect their patient-reported outcomes, for example. And the fourth opportunity identified is to use secondary data to populate in the medical information and to enrich and broaden the medical history. For example, the primary data do not have the longitudinal medical history, but from the secondary data, we can enrich that information. And then after the trial completion, maybe the patient are not optimally followed up. By linking with secondary data, maybe we can extend the follow-up for the trial patients. That's the fourth opportunity identified. And also, there's a fancy opportunity of extrapolation from clinical data to real-world data, real-world population, to learn from each other. What if the clinical data, a patient in clinical trials will happen in real-world evidence? So it's a 2 ways of learning opportunity. And also we also identified the opportunity to use primary data to validate secondary data. For example, we can cross-check the consistency of the same variable coming from the primary database to the secondary database. And the last one, last opportunity we identified is to use the primary data for PROs can be collected to supplement secondary data, because in the real world setting, PRO is not routinely collected, but clinical trial data often have the PROs. Also, we find many challenges which we want to find solutions. The first one is more coming from the linkage procedure. It's really hard to find to identify the right patients across different databases. and also to access patients after primary data has been collected, how to make sure patient consent for this extended data collection on PROs, for example, and also to ensure the internal validity of the hybrid bridge is really key. And we also talk about the prospective approach, and we try to avoid selection bias and align data collection from the primary to secondary, and also be consistent in defining variables. And then the risk of conflicting data, for example, you find one patient, the patient was not a smoker in one database, and so suddenly another one for the same period of time is a smoker. So that's the conflict of data. And we also find it's challenging to have different quality data in one analysis, and the result of the analysis will be impacted by the worst data that with the worst quality. And then in the breakout session 3, we have a second question discussed. Are there any standardized or harmonized approaches beyond existing guidance that we can suggest for the acquisition of study-specific data? So firstly, we are thinking about the parent initiative. That's a joint action of registries. They have recommendations for how to link database. And there's another one giving guidance on registry-based randomized studies coming from Scandinavian countries. And also we also discussed how to improve the quality of data linkage, whether it's one-to-one data linkage or probabilistic data linkage, and some suggestion to increase transparency and to share standards and to share our algorithm and to improve the accuracy. And colleagues in the discussion kindly shared the link from a company who is specialized in data linkage, and also complemented by a scientific publication on approaches to data linkage, which we can check later when you are interested. And finally, we also try to brainstorm what will be the data quality framework for the hybrid approach. The first one is really to implement from the initiation. We need to be very clear from designing the primary data set to be clear that in the later stage, those variables will be used in the secondary setting. And then we also want to say, discussed the same data common model should be applied in the primary and secondary data usage, and also to avoid duplication for data collection. For example, we shouldn't ask the doctor to type in the same data for 2 times. One is for the clinical research and the other for their practice records. And also we discussed the formal procedures to select data from existing data sources for both primary and secondary data use. So that's in a very brief time to really capture all the brains that brought to the discussion. Thank you so much, Chair. Hand over to you.
Thank you very much, Li-Fan Liu. Thank you, the 3 of you, rapporteurs. You did a great job. Thank you very much. Then we move to Christian Reich now. Actually, he's presenting some initial ideas on how to structure a data quality framework suitable for regulation purposes. So he's presenting some of the key points that could be discussed then later on in the discussion session. So Christian, are you ready? We can see your slides now.
Yeah, you can see me.
Yep, absolutely. Please, the floor is yours. Just 1 minute.
No, can you hear me now?
Yeah, we can hear you. I think we all.
Good. Now, yeah, we are fighting with different computers trying to do the same thing and then getting into each other's thing. So yeah, so why are we doing all this, right? So we are trying to come up with a data quality framework where we need one. And obviously, we just are having this workshop. So right now, we are in the process of collecting all the things that we need to consider, all the questions. and all the thoughts. And so what we just did in the breakout session is, well, from what I heard so far, is very much aligned with what we were thinking as well, and what we would like to put to the collective wisdom of the group here as we go forward. And I just wanted to give you a little bit of an overview of how we're thinking about this. Okay, so first slide. By the way, I have to introduce myself. Christian Reich, VP Real World Solutions at IQVIA, and working with our colleagues at the EMA on this particular project. This slide is stolen from the Big Data Task Force. This is what these people suggest somebody does in order to come up with a data quality framework. And it makes 100% sense. So we didn't even retype it, we just pasted it. So first one is fix the terminology when you talk about things. So is precision and accuracy and sensitivity and specificity, what are these things? Are they the same? Are they overlapping? There's so many terms that are flying. We need to get a nomenclature down. So that's the first task. And TDAS is actively engaged in this already. Second one is figure out what are the dimensions that we need to be thinking about. Third is come up with a mandate of what needs to be done, the procedures. And fourth is to communicate this very clearly and transparently for everybody. So these are kind of like the steps that need to be done. And we want to undertake these steps together with all of you, and of course together with our friends at EMA, in order to get the best possible result. Once that's done, it has to be checked, tested, in kind of like proof of concept. Let's see how it actually works in practice. So that would be the second step here. There's a third step, which is actually implement one, but that already is an implementation. That goes beyond the initial project. So right now, what we're trying to do is set it up and then kind of like dry run it on the data. Okay, next slide, please. So what do we think the dimensions are? And a lot of it came up, and I was only in one of the breakout sessions. So, but what we heard from the rapporteurs, it's pretty much jives with this. So these are the four main dimensions we need to think about. So which data? Scope. What's the purpose? What does it mean, fitness for use or fitness for purpose? Which purpose? Audience, who actually has to do something here? You can just throw it in the air. Somebody needs to be responsible for this. And fourth, what is it that these people ought to be doing? And then if they collect the metrics or the assessment of the quality, how is this documented and disseminated? That's kind of like the main questions that we are asking ourselves as we go through. So I'm going to step all of these four quickly through, and there's as much open questions as there is good ideas already. So next slide. So we already discussed at the very beginning, Peter mentioned it, there is primary use data, secondary use data. Primary use data, which is data created for regulatory purpose specifically, is very well covered. Where we have a big gap is secondary use data. And those data, Peter also explained that, tends to be not under the control of the people who use them for the secondary use, because the primary use people have the control. We get the data from the EHR system. We are not in the EHR system, we're not in the process. We clearly need to think about quality about this particular situation, which is pervasive. It's about longitudinal data, we think. And it is about clinical data of patients and actually also clinical data of animals. Don't know why this was supposed to be added here. And animals. So that's the question. This is what we think the scope of the data is, but it is up for discussion. And there's clearly the question is what we do with the primary purpose data. What do we do with snapshot data, like surveys? Is that okay? Is that the same quality? Is it a different quality system? And then there are all these data which are from different domains, social media data, biological data, omics and all this good stuff, process data, like a lot of the spontaneous reporting is processed in there. And of course, generation of medicines and medical devices. Is this same quality framework? Is it a different quality framework? So that's the first sets of questions that we want to bring up into the community. Next. Okay, purpose. We said it all along. Quality means it has to be fit for purpose, and it's very easily said and not so easily done, because now we have to actually say what the purposes are. So we already said regulatory decision making. Okay. We already said we want to talk real world, not clinical trial, which is very tightly controlled situation. And it's not, the little old ladies who actually take the drugs. And then the use cases we hear from EMA and the regulatory bodies is utilization of medicines and estimation of benefit of risk. This is kind of like the core of what we are dancing around, these things. So one is descriptive, the other one is inferential. Then the question is, what do we do? Is the evidence, are we thinking as evidence of absolute or relative? Big difference. One drug against the other, or drug, against not doing anything. Okay. Makes a big difference. Makes a big difference for the quality, because you need to think about the denominator if you do absolute. And then the question is probabilistic evidence what we are striving for? Or do we want to have fixed and hardened and unwavering evidence only? This is important because, again, it'll define very much of what we expect the data and what we then have to check them the quality for. So that's second. Third is going to be the audience as soon as we have it. Next slide. Who is going to be responsible for the quality? So we already know the primary the use people, we can't make them responsible for the quality because they don't care. That's not their problem. Since still somebody collects the data from them and provides them, we believe quality needs to be put as close to the generation as possible. The later it is in the process, the more context is lost. And the harder it's going to be to generate robust quality information. But then the question is, what about the sponsor and the investigator and the researcher? Because they're usually the ones who are trying to come up with some evidence, and then they're going to be asked, well, did you do quality? And then they're struggling or doing some generic arm waving. We've seen this, everybody has seen that. Question is separation of quality and control from the evidence generation. We heard that in the breakout. So if we talking about data quality, don't we always have also talk about the analytics methods to actually use the quality, because they can screw up the job even if the data are perfect. Okay, now what? So isn't this linked to each other, and don't we have to think about making sure that this is in sync? And then a lot of it in quality requirements, people talk about generic things like experience. Do we think this is actually a good thing? Because if experience, for example, just to use this example, if experience is a criterion, we're going to have to start measuring experience. How the hell do you measure experience? Okay, because we're going to have a framework, and the framework will say we need these dimensions to be measured. So now what? So that's that. These are all questions, right? So we're just, if it sounds painful to you, then it should, but we have to go through and find solutions to these questions, one way or the other. Last slide. Which metrics? There actually, people have thought a lot about this. So there are, there's a general understanding that comprehensive is better than than spot checking, you know, looking how many female prostatectomies there are. You need to do as much as you can on a wide basis and then have almost like a statistical basis for doing quality. The maturity level, we've seen that in the panel presentations, several types. Danica gave us an example for the registries, where of course this has been worked out a lot. And then of course the typical measurements and estimates: sensitivity, specificity, positive predictive value, positive, negative predictive value. Oops, flip the two letters. Timeliness, consistency, uniqueness, plausibility, conformance. All these things that can be well measured and give you a good, hopefully sufficient input into the quality of the overall data. Question: how much actually is enough? When are you done? We can't just like saying do this and keep doing it. At some point, people will have to say, well, I did what I could and what I needed to do, and now I'm good. So that's one question. And then, of course, there's the big elephant on the table, which is source record validation or verification. What do we do with that? It's extremely slow, extremely expensive, and you only do the positive cases and you don't do the negative cases. And sometimes it's okay, but otherwise, sometimes it is completely without the negative cases, what we missed, the cases we missed, and a study becomes much less useful and robust. So these are the kind of questions that we asked. We're not going to close them out today. Oh, no, there's one more. The evidence, how it's going to be documented. Forgot about that. Is a framework just going to talk and say you ought to be measuring this, and that? Or should even the quality frameworks be standardized, and where the documentation has a certain expectation of what's in there and how it is, how we can inspect it, and should it even be auditable, just like data? So do quality metrics become data that live together with the data, kind of like metadata, that become auditable and preserved over time? Right, another question is there a standards organization who should actually take this on and keep going? Because we don't think that we're going to get it absolutely perfect first time around. And standard organizations do these kind of things, and they develop it, keep developing it, so that this can be a living organism and can get better over time. Questions: what do we do with these best practices and SOPs? Does that have a role in a really data-driven data quality framework? Is there a role for independent certification, where there are organizations running around testing or going into data nodes and making sure that they're doing the right things, and if they do, then they get a stamp of approval? Is that something that we should consider, or should this be a self-organized activity? That was the last slide now. So again, these are all questions. We're not going to answer them all. We're going to have a discussion in the next 50 minutes or something like that, in order to make some progress. But we realize that this workshop will jumpstart this very important debate, but it's going to take the next weeks and months in order to come to conclusion and to answers to this question. Thanks, Enrique.
Thank you, Christian. Let's get going. Okay, so I think we can move now to the discussion part. I mean, we'll have time to clarify because I do see some questions, clarification points in the chat box. You may respond, Christian, maybe. So let's move to the last part. I would like to have at the stage Peter Bachmann. Peter, are you there?
Yes.
Yeah,
okay.
I can see you now. So the floor is yours. The moderation of this part is yours. And what I can do for you is maybe if there's something interesting in the chat box to highlight for you, I could give you highlight.
Would be nice. So many thanks. And I think what we have seen, we have more questions than answer. And I think I would like also to use this opportunity clearly to say, despite we have it called discussion, that's fine, and question and answers, I think we would not have done the workshop if we know already the answer. So it's more like a brainstorming, and I think that's the important thing of a workshop, really, to shape also the future with the answers that we are receiving. What we now have on the screen is a slide which we have thought it could start for some time for the discussion. But what I see, I think we should be more interactive, really going to the chat, because there was a question from to Christian. Would you clarify how you do understand, define relative versus absolute evidence?
Yeah, it's a good question. So there are questions which essentially ask the data the generic questions, yes or no. So do COVID vaccines work? Okay, compared to the counterfactual. So something to the denominator, to everybody else who doesn't do it, right? And so same is true if you are asking for utilization questions, right? How many, what's the incidence rate of this disease? What's the incidence rate of this drug? And then the question is where? Generically or in a particular population, in a particular group of interest. And the reason it's different is in the first case, you need to have a lot of quality measures about the ability to measure the denominator, the general population, okay, the counterfactual, everything else, whatever you want to call it. While in the second case, you can create very nicely defined, and this is why many epidemiological studies do this, right? They do a test cohort against a comparator cohort, because then they don't run into the problem of, well, I don't even know how often this thing exists at all, right? You are limited in only to a certain disease population. And within those disease population, your data then can have high quality, while overall, for the general population, it has low quality. That's why we said, how do we need to take this into account? This is an important question. Are there quality metrics which will depend on whether you want denominator or whether you don't want denominator? Okay. Does that make sense?
So any reactions directly to this? Yes. Okay, I think there's more for you, Christian, in the chat, but
yeah,
any direct reactions to?
Yeah, I'm happy to do that. So, Marco, could you repeat which process is very slow? I like to think about it if partial automation would be possible. What did I say was slow? What? Which one did I say was slow? Can you go back on the slides?
You mentioned it in on one of your slides that some process would be extremely slow. So So I also missed what exactly that was about. So to think about it. I think it was the slide before the metric slide, but I'm not 100% sure.
Enrique, can we go back to that slide? Oh, Peter, I don't know where's the slide now.
It's not me.
One more.
It was for validation. It was on the validation slide.
Oh, the validation.
Yeah.
Yeah, validation. I mean, yeah. You know, we give me all patients with COVID-19. And our friends in the FDA are very keen, they published a guideline about real-world data use, where validation plays a big part, which means you have to go to the, for the cases, you have to go to the source records and make sure that they actually have COVID-19. Okay? That is slow, yeah, or in clinical trial, people call it monitoring. This is very slow and very expensive, and that is hard to expect it to be done in real, in most cases. And of course, then the problem is you're checking the patients that you picked up as COVID-19 patients, and then you make sure how many of them actually have COVID-19 and how often the data got it wrong. But of course, what you're missing is how often does the opposite happen? They are COVID patients, but the data didn't see it.
Yeah, can I reflect on this, because this is a use case we've discussed for the virtual platform, the European Joint Program with the virtual platform, and in other projects as well. And this is really where we in the breakout session 1 we talked about a lot about metadata and standardized metadata. And so I would consider this is not so this is not a technical problem, but this is a social problem. I've noticed when we started discussing that a lot of people were stuck in thinking about if we want to do that, and we have to send out questions to the sources, to the hospitals, and then they will ask the people in the hospital to come up with those numbers, and people start counting, and it takes forever.
Marco,
right?
sorry a second.
Yeah?
Christian, can you mute your mic, because I think we have some return. Sorry, Marcos, to interrupt.
Yeah, no problem. So in principle, if you have good metadata on this and people do that at source, and that's in that session, I also said it would be good if we make it a standard operating procedure that you provide that metadata and that you standardize your data at source. That this is not an afterthought or something you just don't do. In our hospital, we had it as a requirement. The FAIR principles were a requirement for research management software. So then the vendor had to think about how to do that. We're not there yet, right? But then in principle this is very doable, and then you can do that in microseconds. This question, there's a huge gap between what technology can do here and what culturally we are able, apparently what we're capable of doing. Right? But I think it's a good, we do this on our shopping sites. They do this all the time. So I think we should have the ambition that we go towards being able to do this. And we're advocates of data visiting, that you do that at source, or you keep full control. Every source keeps full control over what can be done and cannot be done. But then in principle, it should be doable. So yeah, we can think about automation here. And we have ways with this metadata. If you have structured metadata, then you can write validators to check if the metadata that you need is present.
Okay, there's one comment on this in the chat which says, yes, perhaps it's possible with metadata, but it will not solve everything. Any reaction on this?
Well, I think I mentioned that, right? So the human problem, the culture problem, is a real problem. That's not the message I want to convey. That's not something that we can just step over because it's technology solves everything. We have to do that together.
Okay, thank you. Any question from the audience?
Wait, there was one more, Peter.
Yeah, but I have tried to do a mixture.
Oh.
Because we have no, go on, but we haven't any question from the audience so far. So please go on.
So Priya was asking a question, are there any plans for Odyssey to create a standard data quality framework template? There's actually a whole data quality dashboard with an underlying data quality system. And Claire, who is in the room somewhere here, knows much better how it works and what it does and what it doesn't do. So yes, so the answer is yes, there certainly is development in this direction. Is it enough? Is it sufficient? Does it answer all these questions? That remains to be seen.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay. So some live comments, some live questions.
Do you have Persephone Dupi, Marco?
Yeah. Is the sound good enough?
Yep.
Yes.
Okay. Just a general comment, since I brought up the two separate issues that in a sense connect to each other. I think that both this discussion about relative versus absolute evidence and the discussion of validation and how much we can automate it, in essence, goes back to the problem of context-dependent quality. If you have critical enough research questions to answer, you will demand the absolute evidence, whatever that may mean, because absolute is what is our best knowledge at the moment we're trying to answer the question. At least that's how I would phrase it. But and in that case, it may be that you have to go for the hard way validation. Not always. So it's more about, I think, classifying the type of questions and the level of quality that is good enough to answer them. Something similar to what you see, for instance, in cybersecurity discussions. I mean, what level of risk are we willing to accept and to prepare for it? Thank you.
Okay. Any further question?
Peter, you have another question in the chat box by Gracie Crane.
How would source records validation work when data is anonymized? Oh. Any idea?
Obviously, that's a good question. Does anonymization, should it imply a mechanism by which you can re-identify patients for the sole purpose of quality checks, right? That's a good question. That is a question. And then the question is, is the data quality, can we live with data quality that is entirely drawn from the data themselves, data-driven? Or is it not possible to come to reliable data quality without somebody checking the charts, whatever that means? So like, the chart is the Lord that speaks to the prophet at the mountain. Somebody has to interpret that too. So there's, even the validation has an inherent error in it. But the question is, and again, of course not today, but that would be good to hear what people think about this. Is there a possibility, maybe at a lower level of maturity or something like this, where the quality framework would require something that stays below the necessity of having to go to patient charts in those institutions?
Christian, maybe I can reflect a little bit on that, what you just said, because I think it boils down to what are we asking, which variables we're asking for validation. And I think if the variables are going to be used, back to the question, are they going to be used in a benefit risk assessment, or are they a critical part of the labeling? So there are obviously some critical variables, and then there are other variables that you can kind of live with without the source verification. So maybe, there is an opportunity to define a core set of variables that might need, because essentially, I think you're basically, the GDPR is going to be in the way. We cannot go against that. So with the anonymization, if you're going to be wanting to go around it, then you need to have a very good reason, for doing this, and justification basically for doing it.
Yeah. Because I think one of the general promise we have done to the public is we're using anonymized or pseudo-anonymized data. So if you now send the message, from time to time we need to de-anonymize it, I think we have a fundamental problem.
Exactly. Yeah.
And I also, Peter, may I intervene as well?
Yeah. Sure.
So also we needed to put all in context. So depends what is the purpose and what is the scope for the data quality check or data quality assurance we would like to put in place. Not always we will need to de-anonymize the data in order to ensure the quality. Maybe one element will be to, if you need to connect some different databases or data sources, but normally you can check also the quality without de-anonymizing. And with the pseudo-anonymization, that will be able to create a way. Also depends on the methods that you are going to use. So if you are asking the owner of for example, the electronic record source that you want to use, maybe they can do the data quality check that you need before you do the data analysis. Maybe that could be also a possibility.
Okay, thank you. Jonas Nilsson, please.
Yeah, I have a question regarding the supporting probabilistic evidence. For me, it's kind of hard to grasp this, because I mean, probabilistic analysis, you do that to take care of uncertainty that you have in your data set or in the variables actually. And this kind of, if we have a data framework like this would be, you would have a lot of patients, and you could kind of get an idea on how the uncertainty is and the spread about the certain variables. So I don't see, if you could kind of clarify a bit what the thought was behind that statement.
Yeah, good question. So look, the classical statistic that you do in clinical trial is that you assume random chance of seeing an effect even though there's no effect, and just by distribution, by sampling. So we in many of the evidence work that we do here with these data, we treat the same, we assume the same conceptual space, right? So the data are there, and we just sample badly, and that's where we see an effect if there isn't one, or the other way around. Actually, because it's big data, oftentimes we don't have a sample problem at all. Sometimes the French have claims data of the entire country. You actually know exactly how many patients with psoriasis exist in the whole country. So there's no more sampling in the extreme case. But even if it's not the whole country, there is oftentimes the error, the random error is negligible. However, the data aren't clean. In clinical trial, we assume they are clean. Here, they are not clean. So if we define quality not as yes or no, but we give it an error bar and give it a probability, we could have analytic methods which take that into account. And so let's say there's a capture rate for myocardial infarction of only 80% in a certain data set, and then you run a rate, or you run a comparative effectiveness of something, and you build that error into the statistic of the inference of the estimate of the effect. And if you do that, then that's fine. The data don't have to be perfect. They can be imperfect because the method will take care of it. Do we want to anticipate such an approach? or do we not want to anticipate such an approach? The methods right now that are generally used can't do that. So actually, the methods would have to make some progress. But the reason that the methods can't do it today is because we never had a quality assessment of the data. We just assume they are good, or we think they are bad, and if they're bad, we don't use them, and if we think they're good, we use them. But if we have a data quality framework, we could actually systematically address that. Do we want to do that or not? That's the question. Make sense?
Yeah, okay, thank you.
Okay, then the next comment is from Marco Rose. Now put it in the chat, so if we let you waiting.
Would you want me to say it? Or?
Yeah, I think it's easier. It's easier to talk than I repeat what I read. So.
It's maybe related a little bit to the discussion before. Is that I find that we often are stuck in thinking that we need all the data to do any kind of analysis, right? And in the sense of that, basically what I would like us to do more, if we think about federated analysis, leaving the data at source, then often the results of the analysis that you do, that you have to assess or whether that is sensitive or not. But the data that you need to produce that answer, to produce the result, that you can just use because it stays at source. And I think manually that's already done. This is what is happening. Also, the reconnecting to the original patient is often done in the hospital, and that data is never shared outside of the hospital or outside of a doctor's practice. So that it is already common practice in the manual sense, but we don't make this distinction in our policies and in our thinking. And I think that's an obstacle. It would be useful. And there's also all the times I asked of legal people, apparently this is also entirely not developed yet. This way of thinking, and I think it would be useful if we start doing that. Coming back to why this is also very important to me in the rare disease world, anonymization is very difficult for rare diseases. So then this might be a better way to deal with that problem.
Yeah, thank you. Enrique, please.
If I may, Peter.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Whoever.
Thank you. Maybe building upon what Marco just said, and then back to the purpose, because I have two reflections to maybe try to be short enough. In the end, in the secondary use of real-world data, we have to mobilize many times sensitive data. So and this data is evolving over time, and many times you need to link different data sources, and many times to update the data sources over the years, because you need to do, for example, prospective studies. If so, it's not prospective in a sense, because you are taking the data now that is just the past. But anyway, is longitudinal in any case. So you need pseudonyms. And an advantage of the federated approach are two advantages. One is that pseudonymization is made at origin in the end. So the data controllers or the data processors that are close to the data controllers might do that work for you. So if needed, they can de-anonymize, so revert to, for example, in terms of a patient has to be discovered something wrong is in the use of some drugs. So the identification is required. Should be infrequent, but should be the case. And that the other point is that the pseudonymization process, the data collection process in the data processor is close to the place where the data is collected. So the expertise on the data is in there. So the federated approach should be taken much in the conversations. And with regard to the purpose, in TERAS, it's just a reflection. Is as you may remember, it's not just regulation, but also policy making and health research, but we are building archetypical research questions as use cases. And the archetypical research questions are very high level use cases in the end. And then out of these archetypical research questions, you have a typical study design. So maybe a good thing to assess and validate the quality of the data will come out of the definition or after the definition of the proper use case. So for example, if you want to make mobilizing real-world data causal inference on individuals using an observational study that emulates a randomized clinical trial, then you need very high quality data that you are required yourself to provide accurate estimates on the individuals, because you are talking about the effectiveness of a drug or you're talking about the safety in real life. But what you want to do is hypothesis generation, which is another archetypical question. For example, technology repurposing. You just may need an in silico machine learning study, and then the level of the quality of the data you may use or could be not that high level. So my suggestion would be to look for those archetypical questions that are for absolute use for regulation purposes, and then try to fix, this is the fitting for purpose, try to fix the level of quality according to that. Well, fixing is a too hard word at this point, but at least having a good sense of the level of quality you will be required to have to respond to the question of interest.
Thank you. Any reactions, comments to this? Because that's for me, the question on a federated model. It opens immediately for me the question: federated for the European Union economic area, or do we need a bigger thinking outside of our nice European Union, which then also raises a question about, do we need an international approach on a data quality format? Marco?
Yeah, so if I may, I think this will be by default international, because that's the what we all do. We share the standards that we use, and it will be. I'm also, based on experience, it will always be a bit messy. So there will be standards, because this requires standards, right? You need to apply standards at source, and that's how federation works. Otherwise, federation doesn't work. This is how the internet works. We're all using it right now, right? That's so it requires those agreements, and I wouldn't know why that would be limited to any particular region. There will be differences. It has happened that, for instance, the US uses a certain standard for something, and then Europe uses a different standard, and we have to make a mapping or some connection between the two. That usually does happen then. So and in the end, it's for federation. It's applied at source. So it's about what you do at source, and by what you do at source, you make your station, so to say, your place, your location, part of the ecosystem. And then you can also have off and on switches for, when a request comes from the US, then it's a no. When it comes from Germany, it's a yes. Those kind of things you can do in the standardized metadata, but you do it at source. So I would say it's almost by definition it will be global.
Yeah, but even the internet needs international organization to run it.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. No, so I agree with that. Yeah. So I would say that it can emerge from different places, but in the end, that's why we have a Research Data Alliance and these kind of international organizations where this eventually happens.
Okay, thank you. Any further comments?
Peter, maybe. So maybe what we can take from this discussion is that we could reflect as well on which could be a potential vehicle for making international harmonization on this topic. For example, in ISO and in other standardization area, we have a lot of data quality standard already defined for specific use cases. So maybe we will be able in the future to reach something similar, but maybe we needed to define steps in order to arrive there. Maybe we needed to try to sort out in Europe first, and maybe after looking broader, maybe step by step. This is what I would approach it.
Yeah, I would agree with you, because if we can sort something out in Europe, I think the rest is not so difficult. That at least my experience. Because we have a lot of variety in the European Union, different ideas. Okay, there was a short hand.
It was Racy Crane, actually.
Yeah. Yes, please go ahead.
I was just going to make the same comment as the previous person, actually. That if there's an, it would be, I think from an FPA perspective, it would be great to have international cooperation. I think there's this natural, dialogue that's happening with the FDA, and I think we were also thinking that maybe there's an opportunity to follow something like the ICH, and I think the previous person also talked about these global standards as well. So I think we were making the same point here. But I also appreciate you want to sort out your own house, Europe first, before you step out.
Yeah, as I said, the European house is a little complicated, so it would be a good idea.
Many rooms.
Yeah, I think there's a quite important comment in the chat from Sigrid, and says, is there a risk that the data quality framework will prevent use of data sources for currently accepted use cases? For example, safety assessment, or even lead to ignoring valuable data sources because data quality control is difficult?
That is actually a very interesting comment, Peter. I agree with you, and we will need to reflect on that.
Yeah, but I think it's absolutely critical, because then we would need to explain why what we currently take is not any longer reliable.
But again, we will need to look at the use case, meaning why was collected in that way, that particular data source, and why maybe is considered not suitable for another use case. Maybe that is the point, and maybe we need to go back to the process for collecting the data, is if it is actually helpful for sorting out other questions. So maybe if we identify that a specific data source is not suitable and we understand why, we may need to try to modify that in a way or the other to influence it, if we think that is absolutely critical, instead of stopping it properly. Maybe there are way around, but that is a very interesting thought that we need to develop for sure.
No, I think it's a very important comment which we need to address.
Maybe could, because of the maturity, as far as I understood, the maturity model that FDA is running could help to not ignore things, but put that in a pipeline where maturity levels are well identified.
Right. Okay, then question from Claire, or comment?
Hi. Yeah, I was going to respond to Sigrid's comment there, because I think there's multiple stages to what we're talking about here. I think the definition of a data quality framework will help us to identify data quality issues, but we know that pretty much every real world data source is going to have data quality issues. And so I think the next step to identifying the issues is then defining what what thresholds or level of low quality are we willing to accept in different use cases? And I think that's kind of the next question after defining what this framework is and what exactly it is we're looking for. And then that next definition is going to be really important. But with the caveat that we always know that there's going to be data quality issues in real world data. And then the next question will be, what is the responsibility of the data owner to then fix those issues that are being identified, especially if we're thinking about standardized data and data that have been standardized based on an international model. So I think there's a lot of things wrapped up in that question.
Yeah. Paolo?
And I maybe another thought is to identify or to compute the risk that using a particular data set that is not fully of high data quality in a sense, whatever that means in the different use case, is. So if we are able to compute the risk, we are able also to understand the impact of using the data source, and we can in that way define also the risk appetite that we can have as well.
Okay. If I look at the chat, I think there are several comments. I'm not sure if I get it right, but I think the question behind is we currently have nice data from clinical trials, and we know if we go for real world data, it will be not as we know it. So for me, the question is, do we need to define how much risk we are accepting? Because currently, to my understanding, we are a little risk adverse. They say, please show me the data, I will assess it, and then you get an answer. So with this new concept, we add an element of risk to the whole assessment process. Not too sure, is it a data question or a cultural question?
I think it's both, Peter.
Yeah.
And it comes back to the question of probabilistic. This is exactly what you're saying, right?
Yeah.
And is the precision that you need. So the clinical trials is bottom up, right? Data have to be perfect, then answer is going to be perfect, right? We can't have perfect data. We know that. So the question is, do we throw? This is also what Sigrid said. Do we throw out the baby with the bathwater if it's not as achieving a certain level, it can't do nothing? Mm-hmm. Or are there questions? Look, if I'm studying the effect of cyanide, okay, and half of my outcome patients are misclassified, I can pretty much tell you exactly that it's lethal, okay, even though the data quality is horrible. So it really depends on what level of precision you need for answering your question. But then the quality framework has to be there in place to be able to make that assessment. And right now, we don't have that. Right now, we can only shrug our shoulders and saying, well, data is good, data is bad.
Yeah, but do we need then either to have something in parallel of a data quality framework, something like a cultural change framework, or we do have to include it? Because we are now only speaking about data and metadata. I think we keep a little people out of the whole discussion. It's a little technical. And I think if we are moving in this direction, we have really to get the people on board. Any idea how to address this?
Well, this is why I raised my hand, Peter.
Okay, then.
If I may, because we know, and because I was going to say the same thing, that isn't this one of the most important questions for risk, is to bring in also what individuals think is a risk to take also about data. We know, for instance, in the rare disease community, rare disease patients are more prone to data sharing than in other communities. That is, and I think it should be. I don't see that I see that as an opportunity. We should make it possible that we allow that to happen. That may be for some. And by the way, in the rare disease world, it's also that you have to live with lower quality because there's just, in terms of quantity, right? There's just less data, so you have to be able to work with that. So it's.
I would not be not so sure if I would go on this with the rare disease, because the big advantage what you have is you have, at least in any authorization, half of the population with the disease, which for other diseases would be happy to have it. So I don't think I would really go in this direction and say you have less quality in the orphans.
No, what I mean is quality in terms of how much data you have. So how much repetition you have, how much.
Yeah, but
so if you have one patient in the world, then you'll have one data set, right? You cannot make that more robust by or do more robust statistics by just doing it on 1,000 patients if you don't have 1,000 patients, right? That's what I mean in terms of quality, and that's when you just don't have the quantity, and then you have to. It also inspires creativity, right? You have to be creative in what can be done then. And that, I think, it requires versatility, and yeah, it is also you can incorporate some of that in the metadata. Maybe people do want to have their quality assessed for terrible diseases and not for the common cold. That kind of thing, I can imagine, is important to allow to happen.
Okay, Claire, please.
Yes, thank you. So I think what we're talking about, as I'm listening to you all, it really makes me feel that this is really imperative that we focus on international standardized federated networks, especially when it comes to real world data and trying to generate evidence that is going to be used for regulatory decision making. We know, like I was saying before, we know that real world data has its warts, and that's what we're trying to address here today. We know it has its warts, but when you take one database and you just use that in its entirety, we also know that that's not going to be perhaps the right answer to the question. And so if we focus on these standardized federated networks, we can start to understand how the answers to the questions kind of look over countries, over databases, and help give us a full global understanding of the answer to the question, so that we're not relying on one particular database with its warts, but we're kind of making this bringing together all these data from start around Europe, but around the world, to gain a better understanding of the evidence as it exists in that context.
Okay, thank you. Oh, there's an interesting approach in the chat. Should risks and uncertainties related to less quality data, real data, be better reflected in the product price, so healthcare payers would be less risk adverse? So does it mean if the evidence is not so high, the price is lower?
Isn't that part of your cultural thing, Peter? Where you're saying
no, I think not for medicine, because we always said it doesn't matter what the price is, we need the data right.
No, but there are parts of the society who could also go away from the binary yes no to a more weighing the evidence, and if the evidence is worse, then don't charge so much because you may not know. Sounds to me like
Carl could clarify. Maybe Carl could clarify the question live.
Yes, thank you. So yeah, that they're currently talking a lot that different parties should accept more the real world data, and on the other hand, we know that there is those quality issues still to be settled. And then we have a lot of new medicines from which the data from clinical trials is all the data is not there yet. So especially in the area of rare diseases, so we have a lot of uncertainties. But those uncertainties, on the other hand, come with very high price tag. So in that sense, I would say as a payer, we are put in a very difficult situation. That in a way that we are gambling with public money, that maybe would like to accept the risks and the uncertainties and the questions regarding what the product does. But if those answers will be coming from the real world data with the quality, with the evidence gaps,
okay,
is it then justified to have a high price tag? I would like really to hear what others are thinking. Thank you. I hope this was clear what I was aiming.
Yeah. So any response? Because for me, it also means if you can over the time show good data with real world data, you get a higher price. So you increase the price for the medicine.
So basically, you should start at the lower level and see where it goes. And if the expectations are not met, then the price will not go higher.
Yeah, I'm not too sure if our society is ready for this concept.
Yeah, and Peter, if I may also, I think that independently from price, we should make sure that the medicine is safe and fit for purpose for our patient, independently from the price, honestly.
Yeah.
So I would disconnect, me personally at least, but maybe there is further reflection, but I would disconnect the price and data quality in this particular context. I don't know, Peter, if you agree with me.
Yeah. So from my cultural background, I would agree on this. Enrique.
Actually, it was Marco first, I think.
Well, Marco, yeah.
Yeah, so I would like to separate them. So I would consider it as sort of a victory for the data world if there's transparency with the medicine on how much data it was based, and that in the doctor-patient setting you can make decisions on that, or in the decision-making process you can actually incorporate that fact, how much data was used, how does that relate to the kind of disease that you're dealing with. If it's very rare, then obviously there will be less data, so you take a higher risk. I would be all for that. Coupling to the price, I think is a very interesting ethical dilemma, because it also feels a little bit that you're persuading vulnerable people to be guinea pigs because the price is lower, and that will be maybe an undesirable side effect of coupling it to price.
Maybe just to clarify that I wasn't, I mean, from my side, it's clear that safety comes first. But if we are past safety, and the cases probably a lot of focus today is on the regulatory requirements, but we know that a lot of interest is using real world data at the pricing end and the HTA end, and there we are struggling. That we believe the work of EMA that those products are safe for the populations, but we still don't know much about, for example, comparative efficacy. And there is the question: would real world data help us with all those uncertainties that we have on the real world data? But still, in the decision point, that we have this difficulty that we are lacking some data, but we should already be willing to pay a high price during the time when the data is still being gathered, and maybe some of the expectation will not.
Okay, but may I propose that for the further discussion we keep the money out of the game for a thing, and I think also what we are doing is more than safety. So we are not letting a product on the market where we say it's safe. but we need a little more about it. Enrique, please.
I wouldn't like to be the last one because we have 3 minutes left. I don't know if there is someone else in the with his hand raised.
Anisha?
Yes, hi. I hate to bring the cost again without being told not to, but I just have to bring another angle again. That might be a cultural difference, obviously, and a societal difference in terms of the funding of these efforts. That definitely is clear between European Union and the US. I'm thinking a mantra of our efforts to establish the national evaluation system for faster and less costly development of infrastructure. So I think the discussion that we have today is absolutely critical, but I think if it's done in isolation from the sustainability of it, especially if the federated system is considered, with a lot of cost will be inquired by those that are actually collecting the data. And there is a reason why the data are not perfect today, because it's costly to do it by the standards and by all the expectations that regulatory agents have. So I think my issue here is that as we move forward, it would be really good to make sure that all these aspects of sustainability of this type of effort are considered, because after all, we would like to have a system in which we're not going to be opportunistically applying our framework whenever a sponsor wants to use a particular data, but rather to build block by block that infrastructure that will stay to be used and reused and with less possible cost in the future. So my cost question or topic is a little bit different from the previous, but I just wanted to put it on a table.
Yeah, okay, many thanks. And I think, as Enrique mentioned, we have to stop the discussion. So many thanks for this lively discussion. Or
No. Is just we have to finish the session because actually just show up. So let me thank you, Peter. Please let me thank you. The smooth moderation. Also, thank to the. To Luis, Tikia, Lifang, and Christian for the great presentations and collecting all the opinions and comments in so nice way, and also and mainly to the audience that has provided a lot of tons of insights for the upcoming works. So thank you very much. And Jesper, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much. And I've been listening in whenever my travel allowed it today, and it's really been a fantastic discussion you have had and some great presentations. So I think there's a huge thank you from the Big Data Steering Group on my behalf and on Peter Arled's behalf, obviously, for the work you presented here. And thank you so much for the moderators, for everyone who did presentations. And the really impressive work done by the rapporteurs for the breakout sessions. When I heard that was really impressive to play that back. So a huge acknowledgement from our side on the discussion here. I would just like to let you know, obviously, that we will draft a summary report of this rich discussion and from the workshop in general and publish that. The general scope of the data quality framework will obviously then, out of the work here and together with IQVIA, be drafted and consulted with stakeholders sometime towards the Q3 or end of this year. So there will be more to come on this. And I think from some of the discussions we've had here, just wanted to play back here, Danica, what I heard you say, that we need to be mindful about that we do this being cost conscious about what it means to introduce even more quality requirements and do it fit for purpose. I appreciate the discussions that have been here. What do we then mean with fit for purpose? And I think going through some of what was discussed here today, just would like to recognize that as we go across some of these many other existing frameworks, I think in the early presentations, we saw a wide range of different frameworks and quality control mechanisms coming out of the analysis that the colleagues at EMA had done. I also would like to acknowledge the presentation by FDA on the maturity model. I think that is probably something we should think carefully about, what that means in a constructive way.
in order to help out in the European setting and hopefully also in a global setting, part of what was discussed here, to really look at how can we define the way forward to improve quality when it goes both for primary and secondary use of data, which I think obviously is a key differentiator as we talk about that. But nevertheless, data quality framework presented from TEDAS as well, really appreciative of the presentation you did here and the questions and the work you're driving to define the concept of quality, where to implement it, where to think about it in a data lifecycle. I think that's actually quite important. We need to think about that from a regulatory perspective. We have some really good general principles whenever we talk about science, retrospective, prospective data collection, and what that really means for your ability to define data quality. Let's think about that for secondary use as well as something to push for. It was actually from one of the breakout sessions it was brought up too. And then obviously how to implement that and who should implement the data quality frameworks. As we look across the European continent, still being mindful about what this truly means in a global scale as well. And then what I heard across some of the presentations also came up in the last round we had on the quality management system, the primary use of data, the secondary use of data. In some cases, we also talked about controlled, uncontrolled data. And what can we do in those settings? What have been done? Being very mindful about not reinventing the wheel around that, also from some of the breakout discussions. I think what's also important here, which I heard from the breakouts too, is terminology, right? So there's some work here where we need to think about a vocabulary, a terminology that we all agree to, because we can probably easily get dragged into the semantics of this, and we really shouldn't. Then I just wanted to on the breakout sessions we had, really appreciated what came back from those. The first one discussing consistency, standardization, and ethics of access. In addition to that, just tells you how deep it really goes as soon as you start to talk data quality frameworks. And then tailoring the data quality frameworks and the flexibility in these. One size does not fit all, and that actually came up in the first breakout session as well, the first group. Being very mindful about interoperability, the regulate and collaborate theme that came up. I think that is actually key and something we need to really embrace, to collaborate around these things. Thresholds for decision making. To me, it maybe isn't so much a threshold, more again coming back to the maturity model. How can we ensure that we can actually improve data quality where needed in the data sources that we then need? Because some of them will definitely have to handle the fact that they may have more errors than clinical trials would do. But in reality, clinical trials are powered to a certain number of participants and also to a certain power difference to be articulated. What you do in real world data may be very, very different, and probably you can with big data or absolute numbers in some cases, even the rare diseases, as we discussed, achieve really, really good quality nevertheless. In the breakout session 2, there were elements here brought forward on the lack of guidance in preclinical setting. And I think what also needs to be discussed here in this general theme is really that we obviously need to align globally around some of these things, because the data quality frameworks around the clinical trial data is, I would articulate as probably more mature than in other places. So definitely not reinventing anything here, but fill the gaps wherever we can. And it was really highlighted to make sure that we do that as an interaction between regulators, manufacturers in early stage of production and development and life cycle of treatments and medicines. Education and training, quality in that context as well, to make sure that we can fully understand and embrace that. Awareness about data quality standards in general. So I think that goes to the training too. And then what comes along with the opportunities in interoperability and harmonization, and being specific on some of the therapeutic areas with the guidance there, because it may actually be fit for purpose in specific therapeutic areas, and we need to be mindful about that as well. Then in the final group, the discussion here, just also wanted to highlight the complexity that comes along as we start to discuss this in a hybrid mode between both the clinical trial data and the real world data, what that will look like. Really like the discussions and the conclusions that came out of that. I took perhaps again with the quality by design view, I may take to this note of some of the last bullets here, that same common data model applied in primary and secondary data usage. That's actually quite interesting. What are we harmonizing towards? The healthcare system, the clinical trials? Why wouldn't they speak the same language? Why wouldn't we then be able to apply in differentiated approaches, though, some of the same quality principles? And I think it also came up in the discussions of some of the things I took note of in that is really, again, what I alluded to, the challenges between clinical trials where some errors actually can matter a lot, and we actually design them slightly rather differently, to be honest, where we almost have a zero-fault culture. Nevertheless, we do have some quality tolerance limits, concepts, and other things in place. And then again, coming back to the international harmonization and discussion here, which I really appreciate, and something we'll be very mindful about as we, in the big data steering group work, in the international outreach, also make sure that we do bring this up and do discuss this. Then I think what also was brought up is some of the challenges we see with real world data when it comes to quality. But there's probably something for the European health data space to think about and how to strengthen that. Quality by design, quality by data capture, something on the long term, the long horizon, the future horizon view on this, because we should be better at thinking the potential secondary use for regulatory decision making into the way data is captured. Some of the challenges we have today may partly be to interoperability, but there probably are to differences in the way we capture the data. Ideally, this data should probably be the best you have in the world, because that is the data that is being used to make judgment about my treatment, my family's treatment, your treatment. So at the end of the day, I hope we'll probably get to a point where real world data also moves towards even better quality, because that's actually needed to make sense of it, especially as we apply more machine learning, artificial intelligence and so forth to it. Decision making from in a digital domain will probably be feasting off that data. So we need to have good data quality on that. On that note, and the highlight of that, there's more structured information to come out of this from our side in the report, and then a follow-up later on. I'll just like to, on a final note, thank you, all of you, for a really engaging participation today, and very much looking forward to what is now being requested, a collaborative approach to the topic on a global scale. So thank you so much for joining today.